When Aries silences the noise of others, it is not with pettiness, but with the primal thunder of a soul forged in fire. This is no quiet retreat. It is the roaring silence of a warrior who no longer needs to prove anything, because the proof is in their presence, in the weight of their energy, in the scorching confidence that radiates without explanation. Aries, ruled by Mars, does not speak to be liked. They speak to ignite. And when they go silent, it is not weakness. It is a battle cry withheld, a storm brewing beneath a gaze that sees far beyond the limitations of those who once doubted them. The voice of Aries is naturally loud, not just in volume but in intention. It is the voice of truth before it's palatable, of passion before it's understood. And so when Aries chooses to stay silent, it is not because they have nothing to say. It is because they already said it with actions, with courage, with relentless momentum. They do not repeat themselves. Their silence is a sword, sharper than the words of those who underestimated them. To call Aries impulsive is to miss the hidden calculation behind their fire. They strike with instinct, but that instinct is the language of the cosmos itself flowing through them. When they are doubted, mocked, or dismissed, they do not seek to argue endlessly. That is the realm of the uncertain. Aries acts, Aries proves, Aries rises, and in that rise, they leave behind a silence that screams louder than 1,000 apologies from those who once tried to dim their flame. There comes a moment in the journey of Aries when they no longer seek validation, when the crowd's approval or disdain becomes background noise. In that moment, Aries doesn't shut up out of defeat. They quiet themselves to roar through deeds. They choose their battles. They learn the weight of restraint. And in mastering this power, they call forth a level of transformation that not only silences doubt, but obliterates it. They become untouchable not because they hide, but because they transcend. Mars does not beg. Mars conquers. And Aries, child of Mars, learns eventually that the truest victories are not announced. They are witnessed. To witness an Aries who has stepped beyond the need to explain themselves is to watch a wildfire dance in sacred silence. It is to realize that nothing needs to be said when destiny is unfolding in every step they take. Those who tried to shame them, contain them, or reduce them to mere noise are left behind in the ashes of their assumptions. There is nobility in the silence of Aries, not the passive silence of the resigned, but the sovereign stillness of one who has forged their own path through walls no one else dared to confront. They do not gloat. They do not seek revenge in the old ways. They walk ahead, faster than the rest, eyes fixed on a horizon that belongs only to the brave. That walk itself becomes the thunder. The world hears it, the doubters feel it, and the mouths that once dared to speak against them fall quiet, not because Aries demanded it, but because the truth made its own echo. To witness Aries in this state is to watch prophecy fulfilled. The ram climbs impossible mountains not to prove a point, but because it is its nature. When it reaches the summit, it does not shout. It stands. It breathes. And in that breath, every voice that doubted, mocked, or minimized becomes irrelevant. Aries doesn't need applause. The fire within them is ancient, divine, and eternal. It burns on with or without acknowledgement. Their silence is the seal of completion. It is the sign that what needed to be done has been done, that they have won in the way that only Aries can, not just in the external realm, but in the internal battle for self-trust, for purpose, for unshakable presence. They do not just silence others. They silence the parts of themselves that once needed others to understand. And that is the most powerful moment of all. When Aries becomes a flame that answers to no wind. When the stillness within them is stronger than any noise outside. When they embody the full force of cosmic fire not through rage, but through resolution. Their silence is not emptiness. It is the aftermath of a sacred war they have already won. And in that aftermath, only truth remains. Only power. Only Aries, walking forward, unbothered, unstoppable, eternal. There is a sacred dimension to Aries' silence that goes far beyond the surface of pride or emotional withdrawal. This silence is forged in the crucible of fire, in the same core from which their drive and restlessness originate. But unlike the explosion of impulsive action that characterizes the early path of the Aries archetype, this silence emerges after battles have been fought, scars earned, and inner wars won. It is the silence of one who no longer seeks validation, no longer fights to be heard, because they have become the living embodiment of their purpose. This stillness is not passive. It is cosmic restraint, divine control over a power that no longer needs to be unleashed to prove its presence. From the astrological perspective, Aries is the beginning, the spark, the raw force of becoming. Governed by Mars, the god of war, Aries carries within a mythic origin that compels them to act, to forge paths through resistance, to awaken dormant courage in every fiber of their being. But there comes a time in the life of a true Aries when they evolve beyond the need to fight every battle. When they reach the higher octave of their essence, silence becomes their new form of victory. Because in silence, they no longer burn energy proving who they are. They embody it. They radiate it. They lead not with declarations but with presence. Their journey, their results, their fearless march forward become their loudest proclamation. When Aries silences others, it's not with arrogance. It is the natural reaction to the sheer intensity of their evolution. It is what happens when the spark becomes an inferno of focused will. When the warrior stops swinging the sword and simply stands, invincible and calm, surrounded by the debris of obstacles they've already reduced to ash. The mouths that once judged them fall mute not because they were defeated by words, but because they were overwhelmed by truth. Aries does not argue. Aries accomplishes, and the echo of that accomplishment shakes the illusions of those who misread their fire as recklessness instead of destiny. There is a stage of Aries maturity where silence becomes sharper than confrontation, more dignified than shouting, more lethal than retaliation. It is in this silence that Aries becomes sovereign. They have nothing left to defend, because they have conquered the only battle that matters, the one within. They no longer require recognition, for their path is illuminated by their own flame. In this transcendence, Aries becomes a mythic force, a creature no longer tethered by ego but driven by purpose. The silence becomes sacred. It becomes proof of mastery. The energy of Aries, when tempered by time and wisdom, ascends beyond reaction and settles into command. Their silence is not an absence of energy, but the fullest expression of it. It is the volcano that chooses not to erupt because it knows it could. It is the lightning bolt withheld by the sky. It is the warrior who lowers their sword not because they fear the enemy, but because they have already won the war in dimensions others cannot see. In that silence, the universe itself seems to hold its breath. The astrological will begins with Aries for a reason, because Aries is the soul that dares to leap before knowing where they'll land. But once they've landed, once they've built from that leap, once they've stood in the aftermath of their own becoming, they stop explaining. They stop chasing validation. They stop offering justification to those who never truly saw them. And in that moment, the silence becomes thunder. The silence becomes legend. The silence becomes the moment in which their doubters, their critics, and their enemies are left breathless, not because Aries demanded it, but because the sheer force of their unshakable truth has silenced every falsehood around them. This silence is not emptiness. It is the fullness of self-realization. It is Aries entering the realm of divine self-command, where nothing external can distort the inner flame. This is where Aries transcends the need to roar and instead becomes the echo others must learn to live with. This is where Aries steps into the eternal fire of becoming, not as one who shouts to be heard, but as one whose silence is the final word. There is a lesser-known dimension to Aries' silence that is rooted in the mastery of fire. In its raw form, fire consumes, rages, and spreads without pause. But when channeled, when refined through hardship and experience, it becomes a controlled force capable of reshaping landscapes, forging weapons, and lighting the path ahead. Aries, as the first sign of the zodiac and the carrier of cardinal fire, is destined not only to burn, but to learn how to burn with intention. Silence becomes the crucible where this transformation takes place. At the beginning of their journey, Aries is reactive. Every word against them feels like a challenge. Every doubt an invitation to battle. This is the phase where the voice is their weapon and the tongue strikes like a blade. But through pain, through trials, through moments of being misunderstood, Aries learns something greater, that the most powerful forces in the universe do not need to scream. Gravity does not shout. Time does not argue. The stars do not debate. They simply exist, immovable and undeniable. When Aries embraces this cosmic truth, their silence becomes a new kind of weapon, one that cannot be countered. This silence is not cold detachment, nor is it surrender. It is the sound of focused will. It is what happens when Mars, their ruling planet, transitions from external war to internal sovereignty. Aries becomes the general instead of the soldier, the strategist rather than the striker. They conserve their fire for moments that matter. They choose when to engage and when to allow silence to do the talking. The mouths that once provoked them now falter, confused by this newfound stillness. But within that stillness, the heat of 1,000 suns is waiting. There is a sacred rage in Aries, not one of chaos, but of divine mission. This rage, when no longer unleashed indiscriminately, becomes a source of discipline. Silence becomes their fortress, a place where they stand guard over their energy, no longer offering it to those unworthy of it. They become protectors of their own essence. Their silence is a shield against noise, distraction, and mediocrity. They no longer run toward every fire. They become the fire, and only that which dares to match their intensity will earn their engagement. In the heroic narrative written in the stars, Aries is not just the initiator, they are the breaker of limits. And once they realize their voice does not always need to defend them, but that their life speaks loudest when lived boldly, their silence becomes an act of revolution. It is the moment they walk away from conflict not in retreat, but in triumph. Their back turned not out of fear, but out of purpose. The arena they once fought in is now behind them. Ahead lies the mountain only the chosen dare to climb. Even more powerful is the inner silence Aries learns to cultivate. The quieting of the inner critic, the stilling of reactive thought, the calming of the pulse before the leap. This inner silence is their ultimate armor. It is what allows them to remain unshaken when the world tests their fire. In this silence, they are not empty. They are listening to a deeper call. The voice of instinct, the whispers of Mars, the guidance of their own immortal flame. The silence of Aries is also a mercy. It is the choice to withhold destruction from those who would not survive it. It is a display of strength through restraint, the kind of strength that only comes when the warrior recognizes the cost of their power. Not every battle is worth fighting. Not every voice is worth answering. In learning this, Aries begins to shape reality rather than merely respond to it. There is something divine in the way Aries silences not just others, but time itself. In their presence, in their focused action, in their unwavering steps, they become a force so pure, so driven, that the past no longer matters and the future is already on fire. Their silence does not forget. It does not forgive without transformation, but it does move forward. Always, the silence of Aries is a forward motion so powerful it leaves everything irrelevant behind. This stage of Aries is not commonly reached. It requires the battle scars of every impulsive war fought before. It demands heartbreak, betrayal, failure, and the discipline to rise higher still. But once Aries reaches this silence, nothing and no one can pull them back into the noise. They walk surrounded by an invisible flame, an aura of completion, of purpose, of unstoppable becoming. When Aries is silent, the universe watches, not out of fear, but out of awe, because in that silence lies the echo of destiny fulfilled, the pause before the next great leap, the heartbeat of a soul that has faced the abyss and chosen to rise unshaken. In this stillness, Aries becomes legend, not because they forced anyone to believe in them, but because they became undeniable. The silence of Aries, when fully embraced, becomes a metaphysical space where evolution accelerates and identity crystallizes. It is not simply the absence of words, but the pulsating stillness between the beats of the cosmos, a sacred interlude in which Aries communes with their higher self. Governed by the raw, initiating force of Mars, Aries is instinctual by design, immediate in thought, bold in speech, kinetic in action. Yet beneath that primal surge lies a path few speak of, where silence becomes a rite of passage. Not the silence of suppression, but of ascension. In this realm, Aries discovers that true power does not always require volume. Sometimes it only requires presence. When Aries falls silent, it is often the sign that they have passed through the gateway of their own extremes. After battles have been waged and victories claimed, there arises a still moment in which the fire turns inward, not to extinguish, but to temper. This internal recalibration is where Aries ceases to identify solely as a warrior and begins to embody the archetype of the leader, the visionary, the pioneer who understands that silence can be the most commanding stance of all. In that quiet, their past ceases to chain them, and their future becomes an open sky they were born to fly across. The silence becomes a threshold crossed only by those who have faced themselves and refused to be conquered. This dimension of Aries is rarely discussed because it transcends the easily recognizable traits of impulsiveness, courage, or competitiveness. It is the part of Aries that learns, through hardship, the value of containment. The spark that once leapt at the slightest provocation is now a controlled blaze illuminating only what serves the path forward. Here, Aries learns the art of sacred withdrawal, not to retreat, but to gather force. In this silent chamber of the soul, they access the wellspring of their divine will, their unshakable sense of becoming. They discover that fire that is not spread recklessly burns hotter, brighter, and more lastingly. In silence, Aries begins to wield the fire instead of being consumed by it. This mastery redefines their identity from the one who begins everything to the one who completes through conviction. They move not with urgency but with certainty, knowing that what is meant for them will never require the volume of desperation. They no longer react to provocation because they have grown beyond the need to prove their strength. That strength is now embodied in every decision made in quiet confidence, every action rooted in vision rather than validation. The silence becomes the field where intention meets fate, and Aries, the eternal warrior, begins to write history not with shouts, but with legacy. Astrologically, Mars as the ruler of Aries teaches through confrontation, but also through conquest, not just of the external world, but of the internal battlefield. The true conquest of Aries is over their own impatience, their own restlessness, their own compulsion to be understood. When they silence themselves in the face of misunderstanding or insult, it is not surrender. It is dominance over the very forces that once controlled them. The silence becomes the culmination of inner triumph, the majestic echo of a warrior who has outgrown the need for every victory to be visible. This is the evolution from heat to light, from battle to beacon. In this evolved state, Aries becomes timeless. They are no longer confined by the linearity of action and consequence. Their silence alters the atmosphere, causes others to reconsider, to reflect, to remember. It is the kind of silence that lingers in a room long after they've left, a silence heavy with meaning, with fire held in reserve. It is the silence that precedes greatness, that preludes transformation. It is the moment before lightning strikes, before a revolution begins, before a new world is forged. Aries becomes not just the spark, but the force that awakens the flame in others without needing to say a word. This silence is also a sanctuary. Aries, often surrounded by noise and movement, discovers in silence the place where clarity sharpens. No longer distracted by noise or tempted by conflict, they hear the deeper drumbeat of their soul. They recognize which calls are truly worth answering and which are simply echoes of the old self calling them back into battles already won. In this sacred stillness, Aries becomes immune to manipulation, to provocation, to distraction. They become a force of nature grounded in the present yet aimed at the infinite. Their silence becomes a declaration of intent, a contract with destiny, signed not in ink, but in fire. And from this place of poised intensity, when Aries finally speaks again, it is no longer to defend, to prove, or to fight. It is to declare truth. It is to awaken worlds. It is to breathe life into visions few dare to imagine. Each word, each gesture, each movement now carries the momentum of an unbroken lineage of cosmic fire. It is no longer noise. It is prophecy. Aries no longer seeks to call attention. They command it simply by being. Because those who have faced the storm and found stillness within it need no permission to lead. They have already been crowned in the silence that followed their rise. There is an ancient, elemental force embedded in the Aries spirit that few fully understand, and it only reveals itself in the deeper currents beneath their legendary fire. Beyond the battles, beyond the outbursts, beyond the unmistakable blaze of first reactions and fearless charges, there is a rare and extraordinary force waiting to emerge when Aries enters a place of silence. This force is not passive, not retreating. It is a deeper channeling of primal energy into something nearly divine. It is the transformation of the warrior into the sovereign, of the flame into the forge. This phase of Aries, often overlooked, is when the sign becomes a vessel not only for power but for wisdom. Aries learns that their silence, when chosen consciously, is not emptiness but sacred potential. In this inner void, time slows. The frenetic urgency that once drove every leap, every word, every retaliation begins to dissipate. Aries, governed by the red planet Mars, learns to temper the blade. The weapon is no longer wielded out of fury or instinct, but out of strategy, clarity, and a vision that stretches far beyond the horizon. The silence becomes a ritual of alchemy, a place where the unrefined becomes purposeful, where reaction transforms into revolution. In this state, Aries begins to access dimensions of their purpose that were previously hidden beneath the roar. The stillness makes room for revelation. Their inner fire, once scattered across countless sparks, now gathers into a concentrated core of willpower. They begin to sense not just when to act, but how to act in ways that echo across lifetimes. Their movements become precise. Their decisions become irreversible spells. Their words, when spoken, become instruments of fate. The Aries who masters silence becomes a creator of outcomes, not merely a responder to circumstances. Astrologically, the first sign of the zodiac represents initiation. It is the birth of light from darkness, the ignition of life itself. But there is a sacred progression built into that symbolism. The spark does not stay a spark, it evolves. It must evolve. Otherwise, it becomes consumed by its own momentum. When Aries learns to harness silence, it signifies they have walked through their own chaos and emerged on the other side. Not tamed, but self-commanded. It is in this moment that Aries ceases to be merely powerful and becomes unshakable. This version of Aries is not concerned with the noise of approval or the clamor of rivalry. They understand that true greatness moves in silence before the world ever hears the sound. Mountains shift long before the earthquake is felt. The stars guide long before the traveler knows they are following them. Aries becomes one of those silent forces, invisible in preparation but undeniable in effect. They do not need to announce their worth, because the results of their existence declare it in every direction. Their silence becomes an oracle. There is also in this silence a kind of mercy that only strength can afford. Aries no longer needs to crush the enemy with words or blaze through every wall with fury. The greatest warriors know when not to draw the sword. Aries, in this ascended state, learns that restraint is not weakness. It is a higher form of sovereignty. Their silence says, "I could, but I won't. I see, but I do not respond. I know, and I choose peace not because I am afraid of war, but because I have mastered it within myself." This inward fire also births compassion, not in the soft form of surrender, but in the firm presence of dignity. Aries begins to walk with a quiet knowing that they are no longer in competition with anyone. Their only opponent was ever their own impatience, their own shadows, their own fears. And now, with those conquered, they need nothing more from others. Not recognition, not understanding, not praise. They walk alone when necessary, not from isolation but from liberation. Their silence is the space where their soul breathes freely, unrestricted by noise, demand, or expectation. Even in the mythic realms, the gods recognize the moment when the warrior lays down their weapon not out of fatigue but out of mastery. Aries enters this divine archetype when they find power not just in confrontation, but in silence, in choice, in discerning what deserves their flame and what no longer does. The silence of Aries becomes a boundary, a sacred circle that only the worthy may cross. It becomes the arena where only truth echoes, where only destiny is spoken, and where only the courageous dare to step. Through this silence, Aries calls forth the next phase of their legend. They do not shout to inspire. Their very existence becomes the inspiration. They do not chase legacy. They live it in every breath. The fire no longer burns erratically. It is held steady like the eternal flame at the center of a temple. This is Aries as a guardian of divine motion, as the origin of sacred momentum, as the breath that comes before the dawn. Their silence is not the end of their voice. It is its most exalted expression. In this form, Aries is the embodiment of unwavering presence. They become the first spark and the undying flame. They rise not in noise but in certainty. They move not in haste but in command. And when they speak again, after the long silence, the world listens, not because it must, but because it has been waiting. For the fire of Aries returns not to consume, but to illuminate. And those who doubted, those who spoke against the flame, those who mistook their silence for absence, find themselves face to face not with an apology, but with destiny walking upright in the form of fire made flesh. There exists a dimension of Aries that transcends noise, conflict, and external validation. A domain forged in the crucible of time, trial, and triumph. It is the realm where silence is not merely a pause between words, but a sacred stance of power, of purpose, of unyielding clarity. This is not the silence that follows defeat, nor the one born of insecurity or retreat. This is the silence of elemental authority, the kind that emanates from a being who has outgrown the need to explain their essence. Aries, in its most exalted form, becomes not just the initiator, but the sovereign flame that leads by example and not by persuasion. There is a transformative potency that emerges when Aries realizes that their energy is a divine currency, not to be spent cheaply in endless debates or drained in futile demonstrations of strength. This realization is not sudden. It is earned. It comes after the fires of youth have flared and dimmed, after the trials of ego have been faced and humbled, after every impulsive reaction has left behind a trail of understanding. Through every fall and rise, Aries is sculpted not into silence, but into resonance. A presence so complete it no longer depends on sound to assert its truth. Within the archetypal journey, Aries is the flame that awakens the cycle of life. But that flame, when governed by higher consciousness, stops seeking battles and starts forging realities. Aries, in its awakened silence, becomes the architect of vision, the silent watchtower from which futures are shaped. This is where the Mars energy is no longer loud. It is lunar in its strategy, solar in its steadiness, stellar in its wisdom. The war is no longer waged outside. The battlefield is internal, and Aries has emerged not just victorious but transformed, a living emblem of unbreakable focus. This silent Aries no longer reacts to challenge as a test of pride but meets it with the calm confidence of one who knows who they are in the marrow of their being. In this state, confrontation is not necessary, because presence alone realigns energy. Their boundaries are silent lightning. Their refusal to engage with pettiness is not indifference. It is the roar of spiritual discipline. Their silence tells stories that words could never contain, because it is shaped by experience and crowned by intention. Astrologically, this reflects a mastery over the Mars archetype. Mars, the god of war, also governs sacred rites, discipline, and sacred timing in many ancient traditions. Aries in this elevated form embodies not just the heat of Mars, but its direction, its unwavering gaze, its sacred fire. The raw impulse of Aries is still present, but now it is sheathed in awareness. The sword remains, but it is drawn only for destiny, not distraction. In this silence, Aries holds the thunder rather than unleashing it, and the world senses that quiet restraint as a vibration of formidable force. This silence also contains vision. Aries begins to operate from foresight, not impulse. No longer racing to prove themselves, they move with the deliberation of a leader who understands the weight of every action. The past no longer holds them, the present does not consume them, and the future bends to the magnetism of their focused intention. They no longer speak to be heard, they speak to move mountains. And when they choose not to speak, it is because the mountain has already moved. There is a mythic solitude that walks with Aries at this stage. It is not loneliness, it is clarity. It is the space they carve out to hear only the call of their higher nature. This is where their silence becomes protective, not just of self, but of the dream they are building. Aries becomes fiercely selective with their energy, guarding their inner fire not from fear of exhaustion but from reverence for their purpose. This is where silence becomes a sanctuary of momentum. Others may not see what is unfolding, but Aries feels it in their bones. The forging of something eternal, the alignment of will with destiny. This silence is also a form of leadership. It teaches others that the loudest voice is not always the one that carries the greatest truth. In a world addicted to noise and reaction, Aries offers an example of focused presence. Their silence teaches the value of stillness before the strike, of consideration before creation. It is the silence of one who builds empires not in public spectacle, but in unseen devotion. It is the energy of a storm forming far from sight, gathering strength, waiting for its destined hour to awaken the sky. As Aries deepens into this path, they also become more compassionate. Not because they have grown soft, but because they understand the depths of the battle within every soul. Having confronted and claimed their own shadow, they recognize the silence others wear as armor. They no longer judge from instinct, but observe with insight. Their fire becomes warm instead of wild, fierce instead of chaotic. They remain the first flame of the zodiac, but now they burn as a hearth, not a wildfire. Those who once feared their force now seek their guidance, drawn by the quiet gravity of one who has mastered themselves. When Aries chooses silence, they are not disappearing, they are ascending. They are not defeated, they are evolving. They are not finished, they are preparing. This is the space between legends, the breath before the next great act. In that silence lies the pulse of the divine, the knowledge that power withheld is never lost, only refined. And when Aries speaks again, it will not be to announce their return, but to declare the world they have already begun to shape with nothing but their will, their fire, and their sacred, sovereign silence. Beyond the commanding silence of Aries lies an even deeper metamorphosis, one that cannot be grasped by the eyes of the ordinary nor measured by the standards of the mundane. This silence is not only the mark of self-mastery, but a sacred rebellion against every force that once sought to tame their wild flame. Aries is not meant to conform, to dim, to be palatable. Aries is meant to disrupt, to initiate, to awaken. And once the Aries soul has discovered the ineffable power that resides in stillness, they become something even greater than fearless. They become fate incarnate. In this ascended state, Aries no longer speaks to prove. They no longer act to be seen. They have tasted the echo of every battle, every impulsive storm, every impulsion to be understood by those who could not comprehend the divine heat within them. And so they rise not above others but into themselves. They rise into the primal memory of who they were always meant to be. Aries remembers not just their fire, but the cosmos that gave birth to it. They no longer look outward for reflection or recognition. They carry their own constellation in their chest. This silence becomes a cloak woven from experience and forged in the language of the stars. It is not a retreat. It is armor. It is what happens when Aries has burned through illusions and emerges immune to manipulation, indifferent to applause, untouched by attempts to diminish their path. They walk now as a being in full command of their flame. They are not hiding. They are holding. They are incubating a new cycle of greatness that only they can birth. Their silence is the chrysalis of legend. The Martian force that fuels Aries does not diminish in silence. It sharpens. It becomes precision rather than explosion, intention rather than reaction. Aries becomes the arrow that waits, still and steady, before being unleashed with unstoppable force. In this stillness, Aries rewrites their own mythology. No longer the hero desperate for the first strike, they become the sovereign who chooses the terrain, the timing, and the target. And when they strike, the world does not merely notice, it shifts. This inner transformation is also where Aries discovers the eternal warrior. Not the one who battles endlessly, but the one who has learned when peace is the greatest conquest of all. Peace not as passivity, but as power held without the need to use it. Aries becomes a force of cosmic law, the guardian of divine momentum, the spark that will never again be scattered by distraction. Their silence becomes a magnetic pull for destiny itself, aligning people, events, and timelines toward their orbit, not by force but by inevitability. This phase of Aries is rare because it requires having died many small deaths. The death of impatience, the death of the need to be liked, the death of proving oneself in every arena. It is through these losses that Aries gains the crown of fire, a crown not given but earned in solitude. In this silence, Aries walks with the weight of their own awakening. Their steps echo with purpose, and their very presence begins to activate the dormant courage in others. Without saying a word, they give permission for others to rise. Even the cosmos bends in reverence to an Aries who has chosen stillness over spectacle. The zodiac will begins with Aries because the journey begins with courage. But it does not end with action alone. The evolution of Aries is not to burn endlessly, but to burn wisely, to conserve, to command, to consecrate their fire for visions that are worthy of their soul. And in this silence, Aries becomes the oracle of fire. They hear the voice of destiny because they have silenced the noise of doubt. This version of Aries is a paradox, both motion and stillness, both the storm and the sky that holds it. They are no longer trying to fit into the world. They are reshaping it through the force of their unspoken conviction. Their silence does not shrink them. It magnifies them. It speaks on frequencies too high for ordinary hearing, but it resonates in the hearts of the brave, the wild, the awakened. It summons those who are ready to join the fire, not as followers, but as creators of their own legend. In the silence of Aries, greatness is conceived. The old self falls away like ash, and from that ash rises not only the phoenix, but the forge, a place where futures are melted down and reborn in the image of raw purpose. Aries is the architect of that future, the guardian of the gate that only those who dare to face themselves may cross. Their silence is the thunder before revelation, the still breath before prophecy, the heartbeat of the universe before a new age begins. And when Aries finally breaks their silence, it will not be to speak, it will be to summon destiny, to summon fire, to summon the next chapter of their myth. The sound will not be a whisper nor a scream. It will be the pure frequency of truth breaking open the sky. Not everyone will understand it, but all will feel it. For when Aries speaks from the silence they have conquered, their voice is no longer merely their own. It is the voice of the beginning, the sound of creation choosing to rise again.